On Good Friday, we are confronted by the hopelessness of our world. We come face to face with death, with the very real pain and the very real suffering that we know and that we see all around us. And in a time like today, it is very easy to see and to think that God is apathetic, that God is without love, without emotion. And on this very specific Good Friday, we have many reasons to suffer, to feel pain, to feel the hurt. If we look around us, we see the many faces of inequalities, of the homeless in Bloemfontein and in Strandfontein, who are anxiously waiting for food at this very moment. At the same time, we see the millions of people around the world dying daily of the coronavirus. And even more than that, we see the essential workers that work day in and day out so that we all can have a better chance at surviving this thing. We're also aware of the mothers, and we hear stories of mothers who can't buy clothes for their children because of the lockdown. Luckily that changed now. And even different stories. I heard a story last night of a guy, an essential worker, that can't go home to buy blankets for his children. We are confronted by hopelessness. On Good Friday, we see and we come face to face with death. But also, we ask, we plead, we anxiously wait as we turn our face to God and we say, God, when will you intervene? Now there's a story in the book of Isaiah, a song actually, one of the most beautiful songs in the Old Testament, poetic songs, of a community that comes face to face with the worst suffering that they have ever known, with the worst face of death that they have ever seen. And this morning, for Good Friday, we have the unique opportunity to read this text once again. Let's read it together. Isaiah 52 from verse 13.
See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silenced. So he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
In the most serious poetic language, the writer introduces this character to us. The writer says that this was someone who was appalled, disfigured, flawed beyond human likeness, someone that was like a root from dry ground, with no beauty, with no majesty, nothing in his appearance worth desire. He was despised and rejected, suffering, familiar with pain, stricken, afflicted, oppressed, judged, cut from the land of the living, assigned a grave with the wicked. In a way, this servant embodied the face of his society. The suffering and the pain that his whole society went through is present in his character. In exile, nothing made sense anymore. That was their breaking point. It seemed like God abandoned them, that they were left on their own to suffer, that they were taken from their power, their search for gain, their own godly figures, and they were placed in the hands of a ruthless nation. But things were going too far. And so exile became a time of deep spiritual search for the people of Israel. It was a time when they needed to figure out who they really were. They tried the offerings, they tried animal offerings, they tried plant offerings, they tried wine offerings, they tried to repent to God, but nothing seemed to work. It was going worse and worse with them at every moment. But out of this soul-searching time, there arose a few leaders, and we read of them in the stories of the many prophets in the Bible. The people, the leaders that were brave enough to speak the word of God in a time like that. And so we read in the Old Testament these wonderful stories of Jeremiah that called the people to learn in the time of exile to reimagine a new covenant, a covenant that is not written on stone or on anything else, but that is written on their heart. And we see the prophet Ezekiel that says that in this time of exile, God will replace their heart of stone with a heart of flesh. And later on we read how their body with dry bones will get new life. The Levitical priest reflected on the Day of Atonement, how the blood of the Lamb will in a way wash away their sins. And so these were many stories that surfaced in the time of exile, trying to figure out what is it that Israel should learn and should become aware of in this time of suffering. They needed to recultivate their desire for the good. They needed to learn again how to love God with everything they have. They needed to turn their heart towards God's righteousness. For Isaiah, this is what happens in the servant's song. Through his suffering, we see how God intervened. Right at the start and right at the end of this passage, we see how God is deeply involved in the servant's suffering. We see how through this time of endurance, God will raise him up, will lift him up, and will exalt him so that he will live again. And in some way, this opened up room to restore the relationship with God. Because the whole community, all of his brothers and sisters and his family and everyone else saw in his suffering that there is new hope. If good can come from this person who was so despised, then there must be a God. As modern Christians, reading the story, we can't help to see the resemblance between the servant and the story of Jesus Christ. One day, a few hundred years later, the people in Jesus' time were also asking the same question. God, when will you intervene? Things were going terrible. There was no hope under the Roman regime. And even then, that hope was so much against what they knew real life to be, in a way. And we hear in the story of Jesus undertones of this servant. Similar to the servant, he took on the burden of the whole world. Like the servant, he also had to suffer, and he also was afflicted. And if we follow Jesus on the story, in the story where he's walking on the path to his cross, we can't help but ask, God, when will you intervene? We see the suffering of Jesus. We don't want it to continue. When will you intervene? But only this time, and this differs from the servant, the one walking there, the oppressed, the afflicted, the judged, the one whom everyone rejected, the one whom everyone turns their face from. This time, it is God's self. And this is the powerless power we come face to face with in the crucifixion of Jesus. In the suffering, God is already present in the suffering of people. In the suffering, God becomes present to the suffering of people. In one of his beautiful newspaper columns, Dirkie Smith writes about the double meaning of the word passion. On the one hand, passion has this sort of biblical meaning that we all know in sort of titles like the Passion of the Christ. It has to do with suffering. But the more popular use of the word passion, he says, is how we understand it as a heart's desire, as a drive, as a deep love for something. But then he says, it is not so coincidental that these words sound so much the same. Because they are the same, he says. They belong together, with their root being pathos, emotion, deep love. And anyone that has loved passionately will know that you also have to suffer passionately for that love. The times when we suffer the most is when it is out of deep love for the ones whom we love the most. This, says Dirkie Smith, is the mystery of God. In the passionate suffering of Jesus, we see the passionate love of God. Indeed, Jesus, in life, in death, became the ultimate servant, the one who freely, without complaint or protest, gives his life so that others can live. We are sometimes bound to think that God is apathetic, that God is without pathos, that God is without passion. And on Good Friday, the story of the cross screams against every such inclination. We hear that God is a passionate God who loves, and God is a passionate God who will suffer on our behalf. In a time like ours, we too are anxiously waiting. We too are in the midst of suffering and pain. And we are also asking, like in the time of Babylon and like in the time of Rome, we are asking, God, when will you intervene? On Good Friday and on Good Saturday, or on still Saturday, we are still too far away from the resurrection. But perhaps this is the mystery of the church as well, that we too are called to embody Christ's passionate love and Christ's passionate suffering for our world. And I wonder how that might look in a time like ours. When Christ was sitting with his friends on the day before his crucifixion, it is said that he had communion with them, the Last Supper. And on that evening, he took the wine and he poured it out, and he distributed it amongst his friends. And he said to them, "Drink this. This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant." And then he took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, he spread it out amongst them, and he said, "Eat this. This is my body in remembrance of me." And so as people who are part of this covenant community of Christ, my question to you this morning is, how will we passionately follow Christ in his crucifixion?